In past videos, we've discussed how markets behave. We've looked at supply and demand and how they interact with one another in order to decide on or land upon a market price that clears the market, that equates quantity supplied with quantity demanded. And then we've looked at how elasticity, how the responsiveness of supply and demand to changes in price or income or price of a related good, how that responsiveness affects those changes in the equilibrium, in the market price and equilibrium quantity. Now we're going to talk about how we measure the efficiency in a market, how we decide if a market is behaving efficiently. And the answer to that question comes in the study of welfare economics. So welfare economics is the study of how the allocation of resources affects economic well-being. So that's the word welfare means what you think it means. How well are people faring? How well are people doing in the market? How once we've allocated resources using the forces, the balance of supply and demand, how does that allocation then affect how well people are doing, economic well-being? So welfare is composed of two different measures. A measure on the demand side, known as consumer surplus, and a measure on the supply side, known as producer surplus. And surplus is, we've seen this word before when we were talking about having too much of something on a shelf, right? So when the price is too high in a market, we said we would have a surplus of the good or service. And this is a different use of that word surplus. In this case, consumer surplus and producer surplus, sometimes I like to use the word happiness instead. So it's kind of a synonym for how well off you are, or how happy you are, or how much profit you have in the case of the producer. So surplus in this case is a little different from the way we've used it before. In this case, consumer surplus is kind of like consumer happiness, producer happiness. So let's look first at consumer surplus. Say we've got three different consumers, right? And they each have a different willingness to pay for an economics textbook. All three of them are taking an econ course. Ron really loves econ, and he's willing to pay a lot for that textbook just because he wants to read it, as well as do well in the course. Leslie wants to do well in the course, willing to pay $150 for the textbook in order to do well in the course. Donna kind of could care less. She's not going to buy the book if it costs more than $100, right? So who buys the book if the price of the book is $140? And the answer is those two who are boxed in there, Ron and Leslie, will buy the book if the price of the book is $140. Because for Donna, it's not worth it, right? Her willingness to pay, or how much she values the book, is only $100. She's not going to pay $140 for it. So the next question is, how much consumer surplus do each of these two, or we could really look at all three, do each of these three consumers get if the price of the textbook is $140? So consumer surplus, again, you can think about this as consumer happiness. How much happiness do you leave the transaction with that you didn't come with, right? So consumer surplus is the difference between your willingness to pay for a good and the price you actually pay for the good, right? So you come in to the convenience store really hungry, You really want a Snickers bar really bad. You're willing to pay $5 for the thing. You want one so badly. You walk in and the price of the Snickers bar is only 99 cents. Right? How much happiness, if we could quantify your happiness after you walk out the door, how much would it be? It'd be the difference between what you would have paid and what you actually had to pay, right? That's all that extra money that you were willing to fork over that you actually get to leave with still in your pocket and get the Snickers bar, right? So it's the difference between your willingness to pay $5 and what you actually had to pay for the Snickers bar, 99 cents, right? So in this case, with Ron, Leslie, and Donna, how much consumer surplus does Ron get if the price of the textbook is $140? Pause the video here and think about or write down the amount of consumer surplus that each of these three consumers gets when the price of the textbook is $140. Okay, so for Ron, if you said that Ron gets $60 of consumer surplus, you're correct. So it's the difference between what Ron was willing to pay, how much he values the textbook, $200, and what he actually had to pay, which was $140. He leaves with $60 of happiness, if you will, of surplus. And for Leslie, we do exactly the same calculation. Leslie leaves with $10 of surplus. She was willing to pay $150 and only had to pay $140. So the difference there is $10 that she got to leave with at the end of the transaction that she was willing to have given up. How much surplus does Donna get? The answer is Donna gets none. Because if there is no trade, if there is no transaction, then there can be no surplus. The value, the surplus, is created in the trade, in the transaction. So Donna does not buy a textbook because it wasn't worth $140 to her. So she does not make a trade, meaning she leaves no better off or worse off than she came, right? She doesn't lose anything because she just didn't buy the book. She also doesn't gain anything because she didn't buy the book. She does not engage in trade. She doesn't engage in any transaction here, and therefore she gets no additional surplus that she didn't show up with, right? So for Donna, the surplus is 0. Let's look at what this looks like on a graph. So if we were to graph the willingness to pay of each of our three consumers, right? So $200 was Ron's willingness to pay, $150 was Leslie's willingness to pay, and Donna's willingness to pay was $100. What we get when we graph that is a demand curve, right? This is a good place to pause and to note that demand is equivalent to saying consumers' highest willingness to pay. All right, so when we introduced demand earlier in the term, we talked about demand in terms of if I give you a price, you tell me how many you want to buy, right? But we could equivalently look at demand from the other way around. I give you a number of textbooks or a number of Snickers bars, and you tell me if you're going to have to buy that many, then how much are you willing to pay for them? All right? So demand is just the relationship between price and quantity, and we can look at that relationship in either direction. I can give you a price, you give me a quantity, or I can give you a quantity and you give me a price, right? It's oftentimes, and especially when we're talking about surplus and welfare here, it's often useful to think of demand as consumers' highest willingness to pay. So the demand curve, we can go back to our picture here of a demand curve. The demand curve is just a graph of the consumer's highest willingness to pay for the product. So in this case, we only have 3 consumers, so it's a kind of funky looking demand curve. It looks like stair steps. And you can imagine if we added on many, many more consumers of textbooks, that our stair steps would get smaller and smaller, and we'd eventually end up with the demand curve we're used to, that's just a sort of solid straight line, downward sloping. So you can think of our usual demand curve as something like this, where we have graphed consumers' highest willingness to pay for a bunch of consumers. We just squish them all together and it becomes that straight line. So in this case, we have 3 consumers, and we've graphed each one's highest willingness to pay, and we end up with a demand curve. What does this demand curve tell us? It tells us that at each price, so at a price of 200, we'll sell 1 textbook. If we drop the price anywhere between 200 and 150, we'll still sell just 1 textbook. As soon as the price gets to 150 or below, we'll sell 2 textbooks. Until it gets down to 100 or below, then we'll sell 3 textbooks. So that's what it's telling us here, in terms of, if I give you a price, you give me a quantity, right? So you can read those quantities off of this graph as well. So this is our demand curve. So we can think about how much surplus would be in the market if the price of a textbook were $175. And the answer is, first of all, let's think about how many textbooks would we sell. If the price is $175, the only person willing to buy the textbook is Ron, right? Because the next 2 folks aren't willing to pay more than $150 or $100 for it. So only Ron buys the textbook. And how much surplus does Ron get? He gets surplus equal to the area between the price that he actually pays and his demand curve, the price he was willing to pay. He gets a surplus of $25, which is this 25 times 1 textbook that he purchased, right? What if the price of a textbook were $125? Now how much surplus would there be in the market? Well, now we'll sell 2 textbooks. For the first textbook that we sell, we'll sell it to Ron. And Ron gets $75 worth of surplus off of it, right? Because he's willing to pay $200, he only had to pay $125. So Ron's surplus then is $75. But Ron's not the only one who buys the book. If the price is $125, Leslie will also purchase it because she's willing to pay up to $150. Her surplus then is $25. So the total surplus in the market is the sum of those 2. The total surplus in the market is $100 if the price is $125. And notice that that's equal to the area. If you were to geometrically calculate the area between the price that they're actually paying for the book and the demand curve, right? So here we have the area of this part of the rectangle would be 75. The area of this part of the rectangle would be 25. Add those together, you get the total area between the price actually paid and the demand curve, or the willingness to pay. Now, what about producer surplus? The story is very similar, but on the other side of the market. So suppose that 3 people, Anne, April, and Andy, opt out of the economics course and decide to go into the tutoring business, right? So let's think about their willingness to sell. So producer surplus, consumer surplus depended on the consumer's highest willingness to pay. Now, producer surplus is the other side of the market. It's supply. And supply is the producer's lowest willingness to sell. So the supply curve that we've looked at before, it's often useful to think of it as the lowest willingness to sell by producers. You're not willing to accept a price lower than this to sell your product. You'd rather just hold on to the product if the price is any lower than what you've identified on the supply curve. So demand is consumers' highest willingness to pay, and supply is producers' lowest willingness to sell. So what is Ann, April, and Andy's willingness to sell? Let's look at it. So these are just numbers that are made up, right? So there's no calculation to figure out what these numbers are in this case. They're made up for these students. So Andy is willing to tutor for $30 an hour. April is willing to tutor for $20 an hour. And Ann is willing to tutor for $10 an hour or more, right? So if this is your lowest willingness to sell, you certainly will accept anything higher as well. So if the market price, the going price for economics tutoring is $25 an hour, who's going to tutor? The answer is April and Ann are going to tutor, right? Andy won't tutor because it's not worth it to him to tutor for anything less than $30 an hour. So, how much producer surplus will each of these two sellers, tutors, get if the price of tutoring is $25? So producer surplus, similar to what we talked about on the consumer side, producer surplus is the difference between the willingness to sell a good and the price you actually receive for that good. So in other words, it's your extra happiness that you leave a transaction with, right? You walk in willing to tutor for $20 an hour and you get paid $25, right? How much extra happiness did you leave with? You left with a producer surplus of $5 an hour, right? $5 an hour that you received that you were willing to do it without, right? And so Ann similarly leaves with a producer surplus of $15 an hour, the difference between what she was willing to do it for and what she actually receives. How much producer surplus does Andy get? The answer is 0, because Andy does not engage in any transactions. There is no surplus where there is no transaction. So just like we did on the consumer side, we can graph this for producer surplus. If we graph each of our sellers' lowest willingness to sell, so for Ann it's $10, for April it's $20, and for Andy it's $30, we get a stair-step supply curve, just like we saw the stair-step demand curve on the other side. So you can think about our typical supply curve that's a straight line, upward sloping, as stair steps that get really close to each other. So when we have more than just a few sellers, we have a bunch of sellers, we map out all of their lowest willingness to pay, lowest willingness to accept or sell, then we end up with a smooth supply curve. But in this case, since we only have 3 sellers, our supply curve is this sort of stair-step looking supply curve. So we can think about surplus in terms of the supply curve in just the same way we talked about consumer surplus in terms of the demand curve. So if the price of tutoring is $15, who's going to tutor? Just one person, right? Just Ann. And how much will Ann get in surplus for tutoring at $15 an hour? The answer is this area between her lowest willingness to sell of $10 and what she actually receives of $15, right? What if instead the price of tutoring is $25? Now both Ann and April will tutor, and each of them will receive surplus, right? So Ann's surplus is the area between what she actually receives and how much she was willing to do it for, her lowest willingness to sell. So in this case, Ann gets $15 per hour in surplus. And for April, it's the same story. Her surplus is the area between what she was willing to sell for, $20, and what she actually receives, $25. So she gets $5 an hour in surplus. The total producer surplus is the total area between the market price, the going price of the good or service, in this case $25, and the supply curve, the producer's willingness to sell. So in this case, it's this area plus this area, which is 15 plus 5, so $20 of surplus. Notice the surplus stops where the transactions stop. There is no further surplus on this side of the supply curve. Why not? Because there are no transactions on this side of the supply curve. Because over here, this third seller is not willing to sell for $25. So there's no further transactions and no further surplus. So the height of the demand curve at any quantity can be thought of as what? Willingness to buy, willingness to purchase, or the consumer's highest willingness to pay. And on the flip side, I don't have a slide for this, but the height of the supply curve at any quantity can be thought of as producer's lowest willingness to sell. If you haven't written this down, go ahead and write this down. It will be very useful to think of demand and supply in this way going forward.